Hello, Kobo in Conversation listeners. It's Nathan, and I wanted to let you know that we're enjoying a bit of a summer break, and we'll be back with fresh conversations with authors in September. In the meantime, we're releasing a couple of bonus episodes. These were recorded as part of the Toronto International Festival of Authors Crime and Mystery Festival, known as Motive, which happened this past June. First up is Ben Mezrich, who, in addition to writing a lot of thrilling nonfiction, including The Accidental Billionaires and Bringing Down the House, also has a new mystery novel called The Midnight Ride, which is steeped in American history and Bostonian lore. And we've got another episode coming in 2 weeks that was recorded as part of Motive. We'll let the details remain a mystery for now. Okay, here's my conversation with Ben Mezrich, recorded for the Toronto International Festival of Authors Crime and Mystery Festival. My name is Nathan Maharaj. I am the Director of Content Marketing for Rakuten Kobo. I'm also the producer of the Kobo in Conversation podcast, and I'm just very pleased to be welcoming you all to this very special chat with best-selling author Ben Mezrich as part of Motive. It's TIFA's Crime and Mystery Festival. Ben Mezrich, I'm going to introduce him because we should, even though he probably needs none. He's the author of many nonfiction thrillers. He wrote Bringing Down the House, the inside story of 6 MIT students who took Vegas for millions, as well as The Accidental Billionaires, which you would recognize as the source of the award-winning film The Social Network. His new book is fiction, but it's no less thrilling. And it is also rooted in nonfiction. We're going to talk a little bit about that. It's called The Midnight Ride. It's the story of a pair of small-time crooks. They stumble into a great big secret nestled in the history of the American Revolution. And look, you'd better read it now because Spielberg's got the rights. So if you can get your hand on a copy, the ebook, the audiobook, get it now because it's coming to a screen near you. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about lots more. But let's bring Ben in. Ben Mezrich, welcome to Motive Crime and Mystery Festival.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I wonder if we could start out with you reading a little bit about a little bit of The Midnight Ride to bring our audience kind of into the world.
Absolutely, I'd love to. And I got to take my glasses off for this. So, like Clark Kent, I've become Superman now. So beginning from The Midnight Ride. It was a little after 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, and Haley Gordon was on the run of her life. She gripped the cushion edge of the blackjack table with both hands as she tossed a purposefully nonchalant glance at the cards spread out across the green felt. Christ, it was hard to keep her emotions in check, push down the excitement coursing through her veins. She wanted to leap from her chair, bear hug the nice old man sitting 2 seats down from her, lift him up in the air and swing him right out of his orthopedic clogs. Instead, Haley painted her face with a bored look, then waved a manicured hand over the table, letting the dealer know she didn't want any more cards. Next, it was the old man's turn, down at third base, the last chair at the table. It had just been Haley and the man for the past hour, because it was so goddamn late in the middle of the week, and because the limits in this particular corner of this particular casino were way too high for its zip code. Haley had no idea how the man could afford a $100 minimum. From his clogs to his resort wear linen suit, the man's look screamed pension. Then again, Haley knew better than most. Looks could be pretty deceiving. She'd been using her looks to deceive for a really long time. And at the moment, she was about to deceive her way into a tidy little fortune. The dealer wasn't paying attention, and the pit boss, gnarled, mildly overweight, belly pushing precariously against the buttons of his uniform as he chatted up a cocktail waitress on the other side of the blackjack pit, was otherwise engaged. So Haley let her glance linger a little longer across the table. The brightly colored metropolis of chips spread out across the felt nearest to her was a thing of pure beauty. And judging from the dealer's revealed card, a 6, a wonderful, incredible, palpably sexy 6. Things were about to get even better. Haley had $8,000 behind her forehands, another $6,000 in yellow chips, bananas, already safe next to her drink, a light brown mixture in a scotch glass that smelled like apple juice if you got close enough. Because, in truth, it was apple juice. Looks, again, deceiving. Guess I'll stop there. We could go farther, I don't know.
I love that. I love that opening scene because it was I was so sent sideways from where we started and where we ended up. But that's what's hard. That's where I wanted to start. Was thriller interviews are so tricky because it's all about plot, and I don't want to spoil a damn thing.
Yeah.
But you know, can you maybe tell the audience a little bit, take them through the story a bit from Haley at the table to kind of what is this a story about?
Yeah. So basically, Haley is a card counter, and I've written about card counters before in real life. She's someone who uses math to beat the game of blackjack, and she's also got a lot of secrets. She's not who she seems to be. She's an MIT grad student, but not really. I don't want to give too much away. And she's on the run of her life, making a lot of money, which she really, really needs, at a casino just outside Boston. So this is not Vegas. This is Boston, which you'll find out a lot about pretty soon. But she uncovers something there when she's on the run from the casino bosses that come after her, that leads her down a rabbit hole towards a secret that goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War. And it hinges around the greatest art heist in history, the Gardner Museum heist, which is a museum in Boston that was robbed in the middle of the night in 1990 of 13 items, 11 of the most famous paintings in the world that have never been recovered. It's almost $1 billion worth of art. And there's a $10 million reward out there for anyone who finds them. And I tied in that art heist all the way back to something going back to the Revolutionary War, the American Revolution. So, not to give anything else away, that's the basic plot line. We've got some other characters that interweave in there, but it's kind of like a Da Vinci Code set in Boston, revolving around, the things that you might see if you went on a tour down the Freedom Trail of Boston, but that go into what really was going on there.
Yeah, I loved it for how deeply Bostonian it was. It was like this is not, we cannot substitute even, they can't take 3 steps in any different place. It has to be Boston. Everywhere they go is rooted in it. I didn't know anything about the Gardner Museum theft until I looked it up afterwards, and that sort of riveting scene where you kind of dramatize it. And it was, and at that point I just accepted that everything in the book was true.
Good. That was my plan. A lot more in this book is true than people realize, especially about the Gardner heist. I have some of my own information that is poured into this book, that I got in mysterious ways. So yes, you are deep in the real Gardner heist, and it's really a spectacular heist. If you're into sort of unsolved crimes, this is one of the weirdest ones, and spectacular that it's still unsolved, considering how famous these paintings are.
Can you tell us a bit? We started with Haley. We've got Haley. We know there's a couple of goons involved in this heist, but there's another character in here. This is about a pair. This is a dynamic duo story. Tell us a little bit about Nick, who shows up a little bit later.
Yeah. So Nick, on the surface is a pretty familiar type of Boston character, which is someone who hasn't done well in life. He's just out of prison. He's an ex-con, really a burglar, a bank robber, who's gotten into trouble in his life over and over again. And he's about to do the score of his life. He has, in prison, gotten a hold of something involved with the Gardner heist. He's basically attempting to fence these missing paintings. And that's where it starts for him. But he ends up getting caught up in this as well, when he runs into Haley, and the two of them find out that they're on the verge of something much, much bigger than just missing paintings. He has to make decisions throughout, whether you just walk away from what was gonna maybe change your life because it gets too dangerous, or whether you keep going even though you may not end up with anything at the end. So he's very much a Boston trope in some ways, in that he knows, Charlestown. He knows all of the kind of seedy areas like the back of his hand. But there's a lot more to him than that as we delve into the story, because he keeps on going even though he probably should turn back. But yeah, that's Nick. He's a interesting guy. Yeah.
Which pair? There's such an interesting pair there, because they seemingly have nothing in common, but as a card counter, Haley's pretty familiar with, entering rooms where she's not exactly welcome, or just trying to, pull off her thing until she's got to flee the scene. And Nick is a burglar, not a dissimilar experience of space and other people. How did you conceive of this pair? Did they kind of spring to you at the same time as like two things you wanted to collide, or did you have one and then look for the foil?
I was always intrigued with going back to the card counter. I've written about real card counters. I actually spent 6 months being part of the MIT blackjack team. If you've seen the movie 21, I mean, we were living that for a while. So that's something that I know very well. So I really wanted the main character to start off, in a casino card counting. This is actually 20 years to the month from when I wrote Bringing Down the House. So it's kind of fun to go back into that world. And then, I know going into the Gardner theft, so I knew that there had to be someone who's trying to get rid of these paintings, because people have been attempting to get rid of these paintings, I believe, for a very long time. So that was kind of the center, of where Nick came from. But yeah, the thing about card counters that I think is really intriguing is they're not committing crimes. It's nothing illegal about using your brain in a casino and doing math, but the casino treats you like you are committing a crime. So she's always on the run, even though she hasn't really done anything illegal.
Mm-hmm.
And in her mind, there's a very big difference between what she does, which is, beating a casino out of its money, and what Nick does, which is robbing a casino, basically, or whatever he's robbing. But to him, they're two sides of the same coin. It's not that big a distinction. But I think also what's intriguing about her is she's a puzzle solver. She's someone who's really, into putting together the pieces. So that was cool to sort of figure out. There's a lot of puzzles throughout the book that you get to. Yeah.
You just a moment ago described this as as kind of the Da Vinci Code, but situated in American history. But there's a critical distinction, because in the Da Vinci Code, Robert Langdon is a scholar and the hero, and we've got a scholar along for this ride, and he's a curious character because it's hard to tell what we're supposed to feel about him.
Adrian is really one of my favorite people that I've ever written about. He is, a professor who really is disdainful of just about everyone. He doesn't like anyone. He thinks he's smarter and better than everyone. He's kind of a peacock who wears bicycling clothes all the time. He's very into how he looks, and he solves puzzles, but he doesn't want to be a part of this. He's very reluctant. And throughout the book, I got to play with him a lot. And he's actually loosely based on a real person who I will not identify, because that person will get very upset. And if that person sees himself in this, I can't imagine they won't recognize themselves. But I think we've all known people like Adrian in our lives who are just so over the top. But it's very professorial. But he ends up with them solving this, but not because he wants to. But he's an expert in revolutionary history and Paul Revere and pretty much all of that stuff. And to write this book, I had to become somewhat of an expert in the history of this stuff. So it was cool, putting it all into his world.
You're probably safe, because someone who's like Adrian is unlikely to pick up a thriller and read something for fun. Right?
No, not for fun.
You're probably safe.
Read it for fun. Yes, sure. Because there's nothing fun in his world. He doesn't believe in frivolity.
Paul Revere casts a shadow over this, as the title suggests, as you allude to that midnight ride. And as I said before, I now believe everything in the book. It's all true. Yes. So it turns out he's a skilled metallurgist. How did you come to learn so much about Revere? Is that part of like what this story sprung out of?
Well, it's interesting how this story came to life. So this actually originated. It was in the midst of the worst part of the pandemic last January. And I got a call from the Boston Globe, my hometown paper. And they said that we're sick and tired of putting, all this negative news in the newspaper every day. We want to give people something else to read. So they asked if I would be willing to do a serialized something, go back to Dickens times, do something that would run every day in the paper for 3 weeks. And so I said yes, but only if I could write this sort of thriller. And so this actually originated as one chapter a day for 3 weeks. It was a novella, and so much smaller than what the book became. But I wanted to always go back to stuff that I already had been obsessed with, which is Paul Revere is not who we think he is. Paul Revere, we only know from the poem, right? We pretty much know the Midnight Ride because we were taught it in 7th grade. But the reality is it had nothing to do with, it was not at all as we believed. Paul Revere was not the only rider. Paul Revere didn't even finish the ride. He was captured by the British in the middle of the ride. It wasn't even his horse. Nothing about that ride was as we think it was. And yes, Paul Revere was a metallurgist. He was the #1 copper maker in the world at the time. He was a technologist, and he was a spy who ran a spy ring and into sort of stuff that we would not expect just knowing the guy rode a horse across the woods. So that was something I really wanted to get deep into it. And then the second component was the Gardner Museum. And the reason I was obsessed with that actually also goes back a lot longer. In fact, about 15 to 20 years ago, I got a call in the middle of the night, a 2 a.m. phone call from a guy who claimed to be one of the people who robbed the Gardner Museum. And this guy had just gotten out of prison for a very similar art heist. And he proceeded to tell me some things on the phone call that hadn't yet come out in the press, stuff involving the crime that made me think this guy wasn't just full of it, that he actually may have been involved. He told me why the crime happened, who had paid for it, and that this very wealthy, famous person had passed away before they could deliver the paintings. And that's why the paintings never came forward, because they couldn't fence them and they couldn't give them to the guy who had ordered them. And then he wanted to set up a meeting with me. So this, he said, I want to meet you at 2 a.m. in an alley in South Boston. He gave me this address and I started to freak out. I had to come alone, all of this kind of stuff that made me very nervous. He was going to break his parole. So basically I tried to move the meeting and the guy got very agitated. He hung up on me and I never heard from him again. And so this was, 15 years ago. So for the past 15 years, I've wondered, did I miss out on breaking the biggest art heist in history because I was chicken to meet this guy in the middle of the night? And so when the Globe called me to do this, I wanted to weave together these two things that I've always been obsessed with, which is the Gardner Heist and Paul Revere and that sort of history.
That also sounds like a great way to lure a you want to take a famous writer hostage.
I know, it is nerve-wracking. As a writer, you get these calls sometimes, and you're like, how far do I go with this? I mean, do I really, I'm not really a newspaper. I'm not a journalist of that sort. I mean, I want to write books that are fun and entertaining. I don't necessarily want to get myself killed.
Let someone else write history's first draft if it means going to an alley at 2 a.m.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is how much of that deep Boston history, that stuff that's everywhere, how much of that was just is that just something that's is that with your Paul Revere obsession? Is it just generally, are you just a deeply steeped Boston guy who if we were to go for a walk with Ben Mezrich in Boston, would every corner be a hey,
George Washington slept here. Yeah. And it's funny. Boston is one of those cities where everywhere you look, there is a little plaque that somebody famous was there or somebody famous died there. I've been in Boston a long time. I've been there, since the 90s, basically. And so I do know the city very, very well. And most of my successful books have a Boston basis, be it, The Social Network, 21, a lot of the books that I've written. So yes, Boston has always been a part of my career and my writing. In terms of Revolutionary War history, I'm a little newer to that. But when I researched this project, and I researched it kind of in a frenzy, because I was giving a chapter a day to the Globe, and it was literally running 2 hours later. I was basically reaching out to people like the Paul Revere House, the USS Constitution Museum. I have lots and lots of sources who were teaching me stuff. But yeah, I do know the city very well, more the modern city than the old city. But, anyone who lives in Boston, when you have visitors, you have to go down the Freedom Trail. You got to go to the Bunker Hill Monument. You got to go to the Boston Tea Party Museum. And especially if you have little kids, it's such a great city in that respect. It's like there's something on every corner that is really cool to see, especially if you're into cannons and muskets and stuff like that. So yes, I do know the city pretty well, and I know the history pretty well. But I discovered a lot of things myself while doing this. When I looked into for instance, the Bunker Hill Monument is the strangest monument in the world. It makes no sense at all. The battle was not an important battle. We lost the battle. It wasn't even on Bunker Hill. And the Bunker Hill Monument isn't on Bunker Hill. And the monument was built to somebody who was a nobody who died on that land. And nobody knows who he is. But we know who he is, but nobody, in the world actually has ever heard of this guy. And the monument itself is this insane Mason, the Masons built it, the Freemasons. And as you know, it looks like the Washington Monument. It's the strangest thing. So there's a lot to it. And as you dig deeper into it, you realize that a lot of it doesn't make sense. And there's a lot of things like that. I could go on and on. The Boston Tea Party also isn't as we thought it was. You know, we all remember the Boston Tea Party being a sort of a protest against taxes, but that's not at all what it was. It was actually a lowering of a tax, not a raising of a tax.
Right. They were mad because smuggling got harder, wasn't it?
Right. The smugglers were the ones getting hurt. And the smugglers were the ones using Paul Revere's spies who created the whole thing. So it is funny when you go into sort of this deep history and realize how little we actually know about what went on.
Was there stuff you had to invent? Or I'm particularly curious about the cryptography stuff.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, as you spell it out in the book, everyone thinks of like World War II as this flourishing of cryptography.
Right.
But as you kind of sketch it out in the book, it seems like World War II was more like a rediscovery of some principles we already had and building.
Yeah, I mean, it was huge during the Revolutionary War. Jefferson was very famous for creating these, you know, basically Jeffersonian ciphers, and he used these devices to hide stuff in it. And Washington used to write letters in absolutely encrypted ways that were then, he had scientists who would decrypt things. It was a really big deal back then because everything was written down. You know, there wasn't the internet. There was no other way of communicating. So you had to hide messages in plain sight. So they were very big into that. And so, yes, I did delve pretty deeply into that. And I invented a lot in terms of all the connections and things like that. But it turns out the deeper you look into the real world, the more mysteries you discover. We're very good at creating these things. As you know, you can go on the internet every day and find a million bizarre, things going on. And so I had a lot of fun with that. But yes, as you go through the book, you'll see a lot of it's real and a lot of it isn't. And I don't really go into what is and what isn't real. But, you know, it all connects together in a very real way, I think.
I wanted to ask you more about this, the genesis of this project, because I think we've all, those of us who kept some kind of records of our early pandemic days can probably see a kind of ambition about some projects that is hard to recognize. Of like the timeline of this just blows me away, of how you wrote this for the Globe, as you just said. You weren't unleashing a thing that, you know, you weren't emptying a tank full of story into the world. You were carrying as much fuel as you needed to get the next piece out. And
yeah, it was a frenzy. I mean, I will say,
it sounds like a frenzy.
They came to me and they were like, "We want you to do this, a chapter a day for 3 weeks." And I was like, "That sounds good. When would we start?" And they said, "Well, we want to start next week." And I was like, "All right, I got to come up with a fully formed thriller in a week. I'll only have a few days head start." And it was I don't normally write. No book writer normally writes like that. I'm not a newspaper writer. And they was doing elaborate artwork each day. And the crazy thing was, each day the audience was building. And so if you read the book, you'll notice that every chapter kind of ends on a cliffhanger. And that was on purpose because the format had to be, you didn't want to lose anybody, because if you lose somebody, the next day wouldn't make any sense to people. And by the end of the first week, we had over 100,000 readers. And by the end of the couple 100,000 readers, it was one of those things that just was, going and going. It was really interesting because I get a call out of the blue 2 weeks later while it's running from my agent in Hollywood. And he's like, "Are you doing something for the Globe?" Because I hadn't told any of my people because I wasn't getting paid. I just did it for free. I was like, I love Boston. I'm stuck in this horrible pandemic just like everyone else. And I was, spiraling. I don't know how you felt about everything, but I'm a total hypochondriac. When this whole thing started, I mean, I was one of those people who was basically sleeping with an oxygen monitor on my finger and taking my temperature 14 times a day because I just thought I must be having COVID.
Wash the groceries.
Yeah, I was insane. And when the Globe came to me, it kind of pulled me out of this hole because I became just obsessed with writing this book. It became kind of the center of my world for a few weeks. And so I wasn't thinking about it until as a book or as anything else, just as this thing I was doing for the Globe. And then I get a call from my agent and he's like, "I'm getting tons of offers for something that you're doing in the Globe." And I was like, "Oh, really?" And then Spielberg called, and you get that call. And, I've had a lot of success in movies. I've worked with incredible people like Aaron Sorkin and Fincher. But as a child of the 80s, getting a call from Steven Spielberg is just that moment, where you're like, wow, yes, that sounds great. And that's when the idea became to turn what was in the Globe at about 20,000 words into a full-size book. And then it all kind of went from there. Yeah.
So it was that's amazing. So it was just kind of coming to the end of its thing, and you already had this offer to make it a bigger thing.
Yeah.
And you yourself still had to make it a bigger thing because they were
Yeah.
not
I mean, there is that,
saying a
right?
bigger thing than you produced so far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, the whole thing was a cliffhanger after cliffhanger, cliffhanger, and even the ending at the time was a real cliffhanger. And so, I remember my dad was the first person who called me. He was like, "You didn't end it yet. Where's the ending?" And I was like, "Oh man, I got to come up with an ending." So when we sold it as a book, I sat down with the editor, and he was like, we need to quadruple this. We need to go into this in a lot more ways. And it was actually very tricky. It's actually very hard. I'm not a person who actually rewrites very much. I know there's a lot of writers who are really into rewriting, but the reality is, for me at this point in my career, I write a book, I hand it in, and I move on to the next project. I write in a frenzy. I have kind of a crazy process. I write very quickly. So, I write books in 10 weeks, 11 weeks. I hand in the book and then I'm done. And sometimes the editor comes back with this change or this change, but they're minor. This was very different in that I actually had to write most of the book after I'd already written the book. And so I got to go deeper into the characters. I got to go add more monuments and more Revolutionary War battles. I got to really interlace things that I was not able to do because the format for the Globe was so short. And then I was also thinking movie. So I actually wrote the draft of the screenplay as well. And so I got to work with people at Amblin and Spielberg's people to incorporate some things into the book that I think will make great movie scenes. So it was a fun process. It was really a blast, but it was not easy. It wasn't something that I thought it would be easier to do, but it was actually quite tricky.
Right. I mean, you'd written a thriller that was tight. It was crackling.
Very, very compact thriller.
Right.
The original thing. But yeah, and then to sort of add without changing the chapter size. So I really wanted to keep these short cliffhanger chapters because I love that style. I love Michael Crichton. I go back to Crichton all the time, and what he was able to do with scarce language and very short chapters, I think, is spectacular. So that was something that I consciously was attempting to do here.
Right. So you had to go back to it and pry pieces open and inject kind of it's not even connective tissue. You had to inject bone and muscle into places where there was no limb. That's some of us made sourdough, but you've written thrillers before. This is striking a lot. I think it strikes a lot of readers as a major departure, but way early on, you penned a few thrillers. Can you talk a little bit about sort of that arc? Does it feel like coming back, or are you're not even the same writer?
Yes. Well, so I've wanted to be a writer since I was 12 years old. I was a little kid. I was obsessed with TV, and my parents, fearing the worst, made a rule in our house that we had to read 2 books a week before we were allowed to watch TV. So by the age of 12, I had been reading and reading and reading just so I could watch Three's Company. But but I became, a very big reader and then wanted to be a writer. So when I graduated from college, I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. And originally I was writing like Bret Easton Ellis and Jay McInerney, these dark stories that take place in bars. And I got rejected by everyone in publishing. I got 190 rejection slips, had them taped to the walls like a serial killer. And then I met an editor in publishing, a guy named John Karp, who's gone on to become a very powerful editor. And he said, "I'm not going to publish any of the crap you've written, but go read John Grisham and Michael Crichton and Robert Ludlum and then come back." And so my introduction, were all of these great thriller writers. And I decided that's what I wanted to be. I want to be Michael Crichton. And so my first book that I sold, which nobody read, was a techno thriller, like a Crichton-esque book called Threshold, which led to another book called Reaper, which was a TV movie called Fatal Error that starred Antonio Sabato Jr. and Robert Wagner. And you should never watch it if it airs on the Sci-Fi Channel. It's horrible. Which led to me working for the X-Files for a little while, if you remember that TV show, and I wrote a book for them. So I did have a series of techno medical thrillers back in the 90s when I was in my 20s. That nobody read. And it wasn't until I ran into this group of MIT kids at a bar and just started going to Vegas with them every weekend that I became a nonfiction writer. So I never intended to be a nonfiction writer at all. It's just that book. I then wrote that book, which became Bring It Down the House, which just exploded. And it, was just a massive bestseller. So that's what publishers wanted from me. So I became a nonfiction writer by accident. And then I fell into The Social Network, which was another nonfiction story. So I wrote nonfiction book after nonfiction book. but I've always wanted to be Michael Crichton, and it never kind of went away. And then, of course, I read the Da Vinci Code, and I was like, oh, now here's another way of going into that. And so, yes, I've always wanted to write The Midnight Ride. It's just something that I tried when I first started out in my career to go, but in a smaller scale, I think. And now, after I've done all of these nonfiction books, I'm hoping, to do this, more. I really enjoyed doing it. So yes, I have written, fiction in the past, but my nonfiction is what I've been known for.
Yeah. That's it's a remarkable thing to have made that decision also to write Bringing Down the House and not to fictionalize it, to play it straight. How did you reconceive, because you'd already gone through one transformation. You thought you were thinking, I'm the second coming of Bret Easton Ellis, right. And then you were like, actually no, let's aim for Crichton. Crichton's right. Like those, maybe it's that kind of a writer.
Well, what's great was I also discovered Hunter S. Thompson. And so when I sat down to write Bringing Down the House, I had no training in journalism. And I think that freed me up to write the book how I wanted to write it, which is to write it like a movie. I wrote Bringing Down the House in a frenzy. I was in Vegas. I stayed in a different hotel room every night. I wrote the book in 9 weeks, 8 or 9 weeks. And it wasn't expected to be a big book. It was a crazy kind of book about these MIT kids who made a fortune in Vegas, and it was all true, but I wrote it like it was a movie. And so when it came out, it was actually somewhat controversial. A lot of reviewers at the New York Times were like, well, what exactly are you doing here? Is this true? Is it not true? And it is true. It's a nonfiction book, but I wrote it in a dramatic way. And so that became sort of my style, this kind of gonzo nonfiction. It's Hunter S. Thompson without the drugs and the guns and then killing your assistant or whatever. I always wanted to be a blend of Crichton and Hunter S. Thompson with my nonfiction. So I don't follow a lot of rules. I write them like thrillers, and then you get to The Social Network, which I think is kind of a really interesting way to tell a story about a couple kids who started a website, right? I mean, the key was how do you make that dramatic? How do you make that into something that could be a major movie? And that's how I've always approached my nonfiction stories. So yeah, I mean, for me, I write my nonfiction like it's fiction, and I write my fiction like it's nonfiction. I feel like the best nonfiction out there is the ones where you read it and you're like, did this really happen? And so that's how I've always approached it. And listen, there are reviewers who don't love the way I do it, but I think it's sort of inspired a lot of people to do something like it. And so since Bringing Down the House, there's been a lot of books that have been written that way, and it's much less controversial now.
Yeah, when you're writing, when I introduced you, I called them nonfiction thrillers. You call them thrillers too. In that run of success where you're writing these nonfiction thrillers, was there a point, not spurred by a pandemic and a random offer from the local newspaper, which happens to be the Boston Globe, something else, another point where you thought maybe it's time to jump into fiction?
Well, I did write a book called Seven Wonders a number of years ago, which actually is being made into a TV series by NBC now, which was about the 7 wonders of the world and a connection between them. It was more like Indiana Jones. But yeah, I mean, I've always thought about it. The reality of the publishing world is when you've had a lot of success in one form of writing, that is
more of that, please.
Want. That's what your audience wants. That's what your publishers want. That's what the movie studios want. But it's always kind of been in my mind. I write for the show Billions on Showtime. I was a producer writer last season for them. So I do get to sort of stretch my wings into sort of the fictional world a little bit here and there. But The Midnight Ride was my first real, major work in this format. And hoping to become something that I'm doing the sequel now for next year. And my goal is to do one of these every year if people read it, if it does well, and if the movie gets made, that would be my goal going forward. So yeah, I love it. Over the years, I've always kind of thought about it. I've always played with it in my head. When can I just write a big fiction book? But the realities are, The Social Network comes out, and you want to do another one.
Yeah. That's who you are for a while.
I mean, you get known for a certain type of writing, and it's difficult to shift back and forth. But we'll see what happens. I really enjoyed doing it.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned a sequel. It's no spoiler to say when we get to the end, it doesn't feel like the end. It feels like an end. There's certainly more to come. How I feel crazy asking you this, because we've just talked about what a manic thing it was to even get the novella produced, then turn the novella into the novel. How many volumes ahead do you have a view to, plot wise?
Yeah, I have a bunch. So in the first book, we don't really get a good look at who the bad guys are, like what's going on behind the scenes. There's a family. And this is actually goes all the way back to that first phone call I got in the middle of the night about I believe, who actually paid for the Gardner heist. In the opening of Midnight Ride, there's a scene where the robbery takes place. And I believe that's pretty much how the robbery happened, based on what this guy told me. And so in the next book, you get more and more into what's really going on the other side. I've got a blueprint in my head of a number of them, at least 3 or 4 different, places where we're going to go with this story. I'm writing the second book now, which is due in May, at some point. So I'm really kind of deep into that project right now. But yeah, I foresee this going on for a few books at least. And we'll see how the audience, receives it as it's just come out and how it keeps going. But I would love to keep doing it for sure.
I assume the second volume is a little easier going as a writing process.
You would think. The reality is nothing in this world is easy, right? Writing is just not. It's not an easy endeavor ever. It's a digging a ditch that needs to be dug over and over again. I love coming up with the stories and the research and all of that stuff. So yes, it's definitely. I know the characters really well at this point, but getting all the puzzles correct is always very tricky.
Right. And the nonfiction projects still, is there anything on the back burner? Or
yeah, so I just had a book out called The Antisocial Network. I think I got a copy of it back there somewhere, which was about the GameStop drama, which is a really crazy story. We're actually shooting that movie this summer, and it's being done by the people who did The Social Network, which is Mike DeLuca at MGM, which is now owned by Amazon. And Aaron Ryder, who produced Arrival and Memento, is producing it. It's going to be awesome. We're actually going to start casting very, very soon, which is really cool. I wrote a book called Bitcoin Billionaires. I don't think it's back there, but it's being made into a movie this summer as well, about the Winklevi twins and their rise in Bitcoin. You never thought you'd see those guys again, and they are back. I have a book called Wooly I wrote a couple of years ago, which we're actually shooting as a movie as well over the next couple of years, about the woolly mammoth coming back to life, which is a true story. And then Seven Wonders is being made into a television show. So I do have a lot of projects. In terms of what my next big nonfiction book is, I don't know the answer to that yet. I've been digging into a number of stories that may become the next thing, but I don't have it yet.
Okay. Well, we'll sit tight then. So go check out all of Ben Mezrich's books on Kobo. There's a link to help with that in the show notes. This podcast episode, containing audio from the Toronto International Festival of Authors, was produced by me, Nathan Maharaj, and I'll be back in this feed soon with more from Motive, the Crime and Mystery Festival. Thanks for listening.